One of the things that the Satan has is that he convinces us that our current emotional states, physical states, is synonymous with our reality, and it will never be different, nor was it ever different. So we think that we'll always be like that. We'll always be people with certain kinds of characters and personalities. We'll always be people who have very strong tivus in certain directions. We'll always be like that. That's part of my nature. I think that that's synonymous with our nature. You see. So if that's my nature, what can I do about it? That's what I am. So therefore, I will not fight or battle it, you see. And we assume that that's what we'll always be. You know. But obviously, that's not what we'll always be. We won't be that way in Olam Haba. We won't even be that way in Yom Mashiach. None of that. We were never that way. Adam Rishon before the Chet was a totally different being. You see. Even the Ovis, the people who once lived, weren't the same as us. We think that they were the same kind of human beings as us. Obviously they weren't. People, you see, who saw the Mishkan with the Shechina on it, and who saw the Nisa Bayamsuf, and who talked and walked with Nevi'im all day long. Because in the time of the Nevi'im, there were 1 million Nevi'im in the time of Yeshaya. You know that? 1 million Jews were all Nevi'im. You know what to live among 1 million Nevi'im? Yeah? It's unbelievable. What it is to live among, we know what it is to live among 1 million Goyim. What happens when we live among millions of Goyim? What happens? It has tremendous influence when we live among Goyim, right? We're influenced totally by their machshavos, by their Weltanschauung, their culture, their priorities, their values. We go along with the entire thing about business and money and tivus and entertainment. Their values are our values. We in a certain sense, we have adapted to these things, you see, automatically. Now, what happens if you took this away and suddenly you lived among 1 million Nevi'im? Imagine living under 1 million Yeshayas, all in your neighborhood. Actually, your next door neighbor was Yeshaya HaNavi, and the other side was Yechezkel. They brought the whole Yirmiyah. Imagine living with these people day to day. It would be an incredible thing. You see, imagine the hashpor. You talk to the guy, and right away he says, "Wait, stop. Koyam Hashem." The Baruch Hashem says, "Not like that." You know, and he starts telling you this and that about the future and about things in the past and about Chochmas, the Bria, all kinds of things. I mean, you'd be staggered talking to a person who talks to God. I mean, it's like an unbelievable thing, and everyone does it. You know, it's not one guy. Everyone in the community does it. In fact, if you don't do it, you're a weirdo. Right? That's what once happened. That Klal was once like that. So obviously the people who lived then weren't like us now. We couldn't handle it. You see, they obviously were able to handle it in that kind of sense. So therefore we see that our current state, our personality, the way we think, the way we are, the way we perceive reality is not absolute. It is relative. And just like our beings, our states of being, is a transformation and a change of what once was, the new state of being will be a complete transformation of what we are. And someday we will not be able to recognize ourselves in that kind of sense. Yep. And if we can understand that, and that's clear in our mind, we realize that, wait a minute, why do I submit to this particular current state of affairs? This current state of affairs, this state of being is not me, it's simply the transplantation of me at this point in time. But obviously I have a certain koyach to lift this over and do something with it. Because someday it's not going to be here. I have a taiva right now, and it's a strong taiva. But I know, wait a minute, if I give him that taiva, I assume this taiva is absolute. It is me. I might as well give in. But if I realize that this taiva is not me, it happens to be simply the current state of what my being is. But there will come a time when I not only will not have that taiva anymore, I will not understand what it means to have that taiva. It will be a total alien concept. What does it mean for a person to have such a taiva? How will I be able to face myself in the future, in that time? You see. So therefore I have to look at that taiva, or that situation, as a foreign part of me, and deal with it accordingly. Another example. There was once a Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah. Right? There was once a Yetzer Hara. People, for some strange reason, right, couldn't wait until they burnt incense to an idol. They couldn't wait, and so on. And these people were people who lived at those times. Now, I asked you, can you wait? So wait a minute, can I wait? I'm not going anywhere. So you say to me right away, what do you mean you're not going anywhere? They couldn't wait. They ran to do this kind of stuff. You know? So you say to me, but it doesn't make sense to me. The thing is a total ridiculousness. It's laughable. You see. Can you understand that? No. So the question is, were they all a bunch of jerks? No, obviously not. Why? Because obviously they had an experience that we no longer possess. So now that we don't possess the experience, we are all a bunch of wise guys. And we say, well, I don't understand what this all was. You see, that's the difference. The difference is that we no longer had the experience that they have. We no longer have that Yetzer Hara, you see, that they had. And the reason why we no longer have that Yetzer Hara, because if we had it, we wouldn't even been able to wait. It's like Menashe said to Ravashi in the dream. He said, you criticize me because of my Avodah Zarah. If you were in my time, you'd pick up your skirts and you'd run after the Getchka, after the idol. You see, you, Ravashi.
That was the whole
Ravashi, I think it was.
That was only at the time of Ezra, and the Piska came down with a Shemaim and said they're masking to the Kosher they should mevatel it. Because they couldn't be Omer, there's the feeling.
They couldn't, that's the thing. So the Baruch had to spear us from that particular Nesoyan. So since he took away the power of that Yetzer Hara, he also took away the power of the Kedusha. So we no longer have an Nevi'im, in that kind of sense. But this is fundamentally the point. The way we are now is not the way that we are by nature. Not so. Nor was it the way that we will be, nor was it the way we were. You see, that every generation has its own koyach hanefesh and its own kufa. You see, and that people who lived then, if they would live now, they would not be able to believe what exists now, any more than if we went back into the past, we could not believe what these people were like. You see, that experientially, the mental experience, the human conscious experience of a person who lived 2,000 years ago was totally different than the conscious experience of what a person is now. Although it's hard for us to realize that because we think that men were always the same. That is a very big mistake. The generations are constantly undergoing transformation. That is why in the Yemei Mashiach there will be an incredible transformation, but a transformation which will be greater than any transformation of any previous generation. Why? Because it says Chadesh Yomeinu Kekedem. This transformation is the transformation. Once this happens, once the Yemei Mashiach, the Irish Mashiach comes down, or Chadesh Al Tion Toir, what's going to happen? We will be restored to the being state of Adam Rishon for the Chet. And that is the most staggering being state that's possible. Because in that being state, when the Malachim saw Adam Rishon for the Chet, they thought he was God. That's right, they made a toast. They thought for a second that he was the Baruch Shalom. And there are reasons for that, because they looked at his neshama, and the truth is his neshama was above their neshama in material substance. So when they saw that, they said, well, it's above us. It staggers us to see that neshama. We can't even begin to relate to it. This must be God. You see. Because when we explain, his neshama is from Natsilis. And Malachim are 2 levels down from Yetzirah. And there's no way they can even begin to deal with that kind of a substance. In that sense. That's it. This is the most staggering thing. This is the aliyah of Klal Yisrael. This is the sensitization of Klal Yisrael when the Mashiach comes. However, this sensitization will not be in its fullest form right away. When the Mashiach redeems himself from the Klippa and begins to bring down this ore, Klal Yisrael will simply become sensitized to the potential of this new ore. It's not going to come down in one shot, in that sense. It is a progressive stage. But one day, and I tell you this now, everyone is going to wake up, hopefully in our generation, will wake up as a different person overnight. You will not become, you see, a citizen of the Yemei Mashiach overnight in that capacity. That takes time. That takes time of the entire Gula. It's going to take to become that kind of a citizen, it's going to take a good 20, 25 years. That's part of the span of the entire Kufa of the Mashiach ben Yosef. You see, it's going to take that entire period, and approximately probably that amount of period of time for the whole Gula from beginning to end. It's on. But from the beginning, it will be wrapped up in this way where there'll be this kind of sensitization. You see, and this is what starts the Yemei Mashiach. I'm sorry, this is what starts, not the Messianic Mashiach, it starts the Gula process, it starts the Kufa of the Mashiach ben Yosef, which we are talking over here. Remember, the Mashiach ben David has not appeared on the scene, nor will he appear until later on, because his tachlis is not current in this particular tkufa. Let me go into a sideline over here. Adam Rishon before the Chet, how did he sustain himself? Did he eat? Was he a farmer? No, he ate from the payers of the gam. He never had to exert any kind of malacha for his food, right? After the Chet, what was the klolot? One of the kulkul was b'zeyas ha'pacha torch halechem. You now will have to eat with the sweat of your brow. In other words, with the sweat of your brow, you will eat bread. Your food now will come through tremendous effort. Before the Chet, in the Gan, there was no effort at all. Because what happened, what the Rebbeinu was saying the following. What was chita? Chita is this lechem, what a person eats, which is fundamentally the main food that a person eats. It's considered the metaphor, the staff of life. It's the metaphor for the central nutritive thing that a person eats. What basically happened is that essential nutrient is now in a klipa. It means, in order to deal with it, you've got to be mishtadel and work for it. You see, it's the same thing with Torah. Torah is no longer easily accessible. In order to learn Torah, you have to sit down and you have to work at it. You have to understand it. You have to remove what's called a klipa from it. It's a shell. Exactly. The shell is what? In order to understand Torah, you have to sit down and logically think about it. You have to think of certain ideas and other ideas and connect them. The immediate truth of Torah is not evident on the surface, nor is it in any chokhmah. Anything that you want to learn, any intellectual discipline, and surely Torah requires intellectual effort. You see, where the brain has to go through a logical process to arrive at the truth. You see, this didn't really exist by Adam Rishon Kodim Achet. You see, the ability for Adam to receive truth was very rapid. You see, it was almost like his brain was built in such a way where he can look at the chokhmah and get almost instantly what the truth was. He didn't have to go through propositions and corollaries and theorems and proofs and so on and all different argumentations to bring something. He didn't have to bring riots and so on in that kind of sense. It was much clearer. This all happened because of the Chet of Adam Rishon. Because of the Chet, as we said, the Zoyma went into the Bria, the Tumah, and therefore it encased Torah itself, as we've said. And therefore it encased Torah and it encased all the processes, nutritive processes of man, physically as well. So man now has to work to undo, to get the emes, the kernel of truth, or the kernel in this case of its physical nutrients in terms of food. He has to work at it and remove the klipa from it. This is the entire thing. In the Yemais Mashiach, such a thing will no longer exist, really. The klipa of that chita, or the klipa of that wheat grain, or metaphorically, the klipa on the Torah will have been removed. So the truth of the Torah will become very, very rapid in that kind of sense. It's almost as the poor person will absorb it in gulps. He won't have to chew it. In fact, even now, the process of klipa is very powerful. It's so powerful that in order to get raw food, what do you have to do? You have to put it in the ground, till it and soil it, then water it and irrigate it and so on, then harvest it and so on. And even then, once you have the chita, that doesn't stop. You have to grind it and then separate the shells, and you have to grind chaff, winnow it, and we call all the lamates malachas, and then grind it, then you have to mix it with water, make dough, and then bake it, and then you finally have it, and then you still don't have it. You got to put it in your mouth, and you have to chew it. And chew it and so on, and then the saliva has to work on it and make it digestible. And then you have to swallow it, and then the stomach has to tear into it and dissolve and digest it. And then it's got to go in your intestines where it still goes through the process. And then finally, it appears in the form of nutrients where suddenly the blood vessels simply take it and give it to the cells. Like a finished meal. You see. Look how far, you see, you have to go from a wheat grain to a carbohydrate molecule. Look how far we have to travel. That's really what it is. Why? That's one long klipa. It's really what it is. That's the Chet of Adam Rishon. One long, constant process of birur. To clarify, to work it through, to strain. In that sense, of a klipa. And everything is symbolized by that. In the Yemais Mashiach, we won't have that. It'll be a much more powerful kind of entity. And we'll see it in a much greater way. What we're going to discuss today is to go on with the union of the Gila of the Mashiach. In this case, of course, the Mashiach ben Yosef. And basically, at this point, we have concluded. We've spoken about the gulas of the gufs of Eretz Yisrael. We've spoken about the beginning of the Gula ben Neshama, and how that starts with the personal redemption of the Mashiach ben Yosef himself, and then the beginnings of the sensitization of Klal Yisrael to the union of Mashiach. The interesting question is, the recognition of the Mashiach himself and how that will take place. Fundamentally, we said last time, what we said was the sensitization of Klal Yisrael allows them to become aware of the awe, this new awe that's going to be coming down, and we described that awe to some degree at length last week. But the interesting thing also, there's another interesting koyach here, which the Mashiach has, by virtue of his particular awe, which is very uniquely a part of him, and it's a very distinctive quality. In most cases, the way Klal Yisrael always knew Nevi'im, was through certain specific ways, and there were really two ways that Klal Yisrael knew Nevi'im. One, that a Navi had to have a cheskes kedusha. He had to be known and well established as a very big Kaddish and tzaddik. That's number one. And number two, he had to demonstrate an accurate Nevi'us several times. And when I mean accurate, I mean really accurate, down to the detail, where he had to, let's say, predict certain future events, how they would occur. And he would have to be 100% accurate. Even if he mispredicted, maybe even 10%, whatever the story, whatever small amount, he would be considered a false Mashiach. In the case of the Mashiach himself, it's a very different story. It's a very different story for certain very basic reasons. First of all, by virtue of what we mentioned before, the Mashiach, the specific Mashiach ben Yosef, does not have an established record as a Kaddish or as a Tzaddik, as we said. Why is that? Why doesn't he have an established record? Because of the fact that in the Ikris Mashiach, he is in a state of kilkul. You see, since he's a reflection of Klal Yisrael, and Klal Yisrael is in a state of kilkul, he's also in a state of kilkul. Well, if you're in a state of kilkul, just like Klal Yisrael is not nikah to be the chief ummah, and the ummah which is closest to the Baruch Shalom, it's not nikah, it's not recognizable at all. The Mashiach is not recognizable as Mashiach either. So therefore, he has no reputation as an established tzaddik in that way. So that criteria cannot be used to judge for the Mashiach himself. What criteria then is used? The basic criteria which is used is the ability which he possesses in terms of doing two things. The first thing relates to his ability, and we've spoken about this before, to release mankind from the effects of the Zoyim of the Nachash. In other words, to restore all of mankind back to the Madrega of Adam Rishon before the Chet. So that there's a release inside the internal constraints of personality in each individual, so that suddenly he finds himself absolutely free of any constraints on his consciousness, completely free to do what he wants to do with total bechira. And this is a total different state of mind. He will elevate mankind from a state of inferior being or restricted being to a state of liberated being. Where suddenly, and this represents it's difficult to describe here, what that state of being. Later on we'll go more clearly what that is. But it's a state where there's tremendous peace of mind and tremendous great deal of tranquility in the personality itself, when the personality is basically free of any conflicts. Now that's an incredible state, because everyone has a great many conflicts within him internally. And the basic koyach of the Mashiach will be to remove all these conflicts within the inner personality of all men. That ability and the understanding which goes with that ability will mark him, will clearly signify him as an individual who is absolutely unique in the history of the world and in the annals of mankind. And it will be clearly recognizable. This is the one basic quality which will individualize him and signify him as the Mashiach himself. what is very important, and this is what's critical, what signifies the matter, not only the fact, what is very critical to understand is that it's not only the fact that the Mashiach will have this ability to do this, which no man has ever done before. No one has ever done this thing before, which is an incredible thing. But what is very, very important, and this is very critical, is the Mashiach will be able to do this, what no man has ever been done before, and instruct or explain how it's done al pi derech haTorah. That's the incredible thing. He'll be able to cure every man on earth from every internal conflict which rests in him and free him completely and give him 100% perfect personality as such and eternal being, but also to explain how that methodology itself comes from the Torah. So in other words, here you will see an amazing thing. It's a demonstration of a very unique phenomena, a unique event that has never happened before, number one, and the explanation of that phenomena will also be given, in the sense that that explanation is clearly written in the Torah. So what would happen is that all mankind would suddenly realize that the Torah is emes. This is the thing, you see. How in the beginning the Mashiach convinced all mankind that the entire earth will understand that the Baruch Hashem is emes and his Torah is emes. How will they know that the Torah is emes? Because of the fact that the theory behind that method is in the Torah itself. So as soon as the thing works, they see, well, the theory's got to be correct. So suddenly, the Torah therefore takes on a new credibility that it never had before. It becomes the what? It becomes the therapeutic device which cures all mankind of the Zoyim of the Nochash. You see, that's basically how it's going to, how in the beginning, how it's going to operate. And this clearly will be the significance that he's the Mashiach, because only the Mashiach can do that with the Torah, you see, which no man has ever done before, in that sense. This is basically how the Mashiach will become identified throughout the world as possessing this unique skill of releasing the inner personality of all men, which of course is the conflict originated by the Zolim of the Nachash itself, and explaining it in terms of the whole Derech HaTorah, the Hashkofim Torah, of the whole Pnimius HaTorah. So all the world will clearly see that the Pnimius HaTorah is absolutely correct. It's correct because it works. There's no greater demonstration of theory than when it works and it explains real events. More than that, when it can predict real events. That's the essence of science. Well, this duality, this shidduch, this partnership will be clearly seen. That the theoretical aspect of the Torah, which is the Pnimius Torah, will be clearly shown as actually producing a result which has never seen since the beginning of time. That will clearly establish the Amitas HaTorah, the truth of the Torah, and the Amita of the Mashiach, the emes of the Mashiach himself. This brings us to another matter. It brings us to yet a deeper matter, to what really is the koyach of the Mashiach ben Yosef and of the Mashiach ben David. From this we begin to understand what their real koyach is. That their koyach is greater than that of a Navi. It's much greater than that of a Navi. Why is that? Because there's a pasuk that says Beruach Piv Yomis Rosha. Beruach Piv, it's with simply the spirit of his mouth. It refers to the Mashiach. With the spirit of his mouth, with simply the utterance of what he says, Yomis Rosha, he will destroy evil from the world. He won't have to get up and conduct wars, or actually get up in some physical conflict. His utterance will be able to do that. How is that possible? The Ruach Piv. What I believe it means basically is this: is not only the ability to give a broch and a klola, which definitely will be part and parcel of the entire matter, but more deeply, the Mashiach will be able to say, both Trei Mashiachim are both similar in this way. But since we're emphasizing now the Tkuf of the Mashiach ben Yosef, we're referring to this particular individual now. What the unique koyach of that individual will be the following, is that he will be able to say, an individual will come over to him and say, I have a certain problem, I cannot resolve it, I don't know what's going to happen. So, he has the unique ability to say, your problem can be resolved in this way, and such a thing will happen in 3 months, or such thing will happen if you do this. And he will always be accurate 100% of the time. He will be able to look and understand the nature of all problems and predict the future of what exactly will happen. If a person comes and says, I have this kind of obstacle and I can't get around it, he will say, do this. And it will always work 100% of the time. Now we know that's not true of any tzaddik. Every tzaddik gives a bracha says that tzaddik goizer, what's the meaning of a tzaddik? A tzaddik can give a bracha, right? And the Baruch Shem is goizer and the Baruch Shem is mekayim, but not always. You see, because there are certain kinds of inyanim where the Baruch Shem is not mekayim basically, because it's more important that the original gezerah stands. But a tzaddik does have the power to, at some time, point in time, intercede for Klal Yisrael or for people and remove the effects of a gezerah. But he can only do it a certain percentage of the time, depending how big he is. The Mashiach does it 100% of the time. How does he do it 100% of the time? Does he do it 100% of the time because he what? Because he's greater than any tzaddik? No, although that happens to be true. But the way he does it is that because of the fact that his specialty is what? It's chokhmah. His specialty is the Pnimius HaTorah. His specialty is the Hashkocha Protes. He understands exactly every move that's made in the universe. Every move that's made in the history of men on the individual life of a person. He can look at a person and he can see his complete history. He can see his tikkun. You see, and he can see exactly what is necessary in order to assist this individual to achieve his tikkun and to change the situation around him. So he'll simply look into the situation and from Chokhmah, he will say, do the following, A, B, C, X, Y, Z, and your situation will definitely change. He will be able to predict with 100% certainty because he will be able to understand exactly all the laws that rule the Hashkocha. That's the das that the Baruch Shem will give him. V'nocha lo v'ruch halakim. V'ruch chokhmah bina v'das. Eitz gvura and so on. This knowledge that he will get has the ability to look into any situation and instantly see the ruchnis of the situation. He will be able to see why a person is suffering, for what particular chatoim, what it takes to remove that, exactly what has to be done. He'll be able to look at any particular event or any particular situation and understand what ingredients have to do with the Hanogas HaMishpat, what ingredients have to do with the Hanogas HaYichud, what the tikkunim are necessary in order to mafias or to undo one and strengthen another. Exactly. You see, so it's the same thing on the individual level. That's how he will know. He will know exactly what to tell individuals. He will also know what to tell kingdoms, or kings, or great masses of people. If, for example, a certain catastrophe happens to a certain large group, a nation, for example, he will say, let them do the following, and instantly the catastrophe will be gone. People will marvel at that. They'll say, how does he have this koyach? How does he have the koyach to clearly state with 100% certainty what will and must be? You see, you should know, a Navi doesn't have that capacity. And here's where he has lies greater than Navi. Why? Because a Navi sometimes can be misnabe, he can prophesy on a future event, right? Let's say he prophesies on a future event, the law, and right, something that's not good. It won't necessarily happen. There are times when a prophecy will not be fulfilled. Because why? Because the hashkocha suddenly changed in some way, where the prophet, where the Navi said something about what happened bad, and suddenly it changed because the people did tshuva, or some other events happened that allowed it to change from the Hanogas HaYichud side. So therefore, a Nevi'us itself will only accurately express what's going on in the Hashkocha at this point in time, you see. And from that, understand the future. Generally speaking, this is how Nevi'us works. But the Chokhmah of the Mashiach is not the same way. Since the Chokhmah of the Mashiach is Chokhmah, and it deals with an understanding, it's an understanding of all the principles and laws which dominate and govern the Hashkocha. He will be able to say what will go on 100% of the time, because he will know exactly how to manipulate, you see, and how to work with the Hashkocha to actually control the Hashkocha. For the first time, mankind will have the ability to understand the Hashkocha and to control it. You see, a Navi only has the ability to predict it. That's all. He doesn't really understand it because Nevi'im never understood the full Hashkocha. Even Moshe Rabbeinu, the Baruch Shem said to him, Gzerim lefonai, which means that it's not given to even Nevi'im to understand the Hashkocha. They cannot understand the Hanogas HaYichud. in depth or in detail, only in its very, very general ways. So it's not given to them to control the hashgacha, simply predict. But to the extent that they can't control the hashgacha, to the extent that they cannot understand the hashgacha, to that extent, sometimes they're not. The question is not, it's not a point that they're wrong, but the Nevi'us does not come out to be correct. But since the Mashiach is such that the old Hagonas, the old that he will have, I mean, the Yaskal Avdi, the Orish Mashiach will give him the Chochmah of the hashgacha to its detail. It will also give him the control of the hashgacha. And that is a unique thing that no one has ever possessed. You see, that's how people will recognize he's the Mashiach too. Because they'll be staggered how a person can be right 100% of the time, in no matter what you ask him. You see, that's how all the Yid will begin to realize the koyach of the Mashiach, and the Goyim will begin to understand this. Because he'll be able to do all these things with the Goyim also. He'll be able to tell them how to avoid a recession, how to suddenly spring up an economy. Exactly, and every time he tells them, he prescribes to them something what to do, suddenly be done. If a person comes and says, I'm suffering from anias, I'm a poor man, I don't know what to do, he'll say, do this. And suddenly the man will find his complete financial situation suddenly overturned. With the Mashiach will come in a new Tkufa. Henceforth, before, whenever there was a gzeira on a person, the person had to achieve a certain tikkun through that particular gzeira of the hashgacha, and so on. What the Mashiach will be able to do by virtue of his understanding of the hashgacha itself is to begin to suggest new ways of tikkunim, you see, that can substitute or alternate for these other tikkunim and thus make it a totally different situation. That would be the ability that Mashiach will have that wasn't done before. Before, the hashgacha and the hesed that was on the world was such that only certain gzeres were given down from hashgacha, and the tikkunim could only be achieved through those particular gzeres. You see, and that was it. And the chokhmah to achieve this tikkun through other means was not given to mankind. With the Bias HaMashiach, with the coming of the Mashiach, with the koyach of the Mashiach that time, with Mashiach ben Yosef, later on Mashiach ben David, they will be individuals who, because of their understanding of the hashgacha in such a clear way, they will suddenly know not only all the they will know not only what causes choile or pathology of the neshama of all nefashis, but they will understand also how to cure every machal of the neshama. And they will understand not only how to cure it, but they will understand many, many different ways to cure these things. They will have a complete spectrum of tikkunim that are available and such, you see. And they'll be able to discern exactly a whole array of tikkunim what to use. That's why they'll be able to do many, many, many things that were impossible before. And they'll be able to do it simply by telling the person what to do. They will be able to do this for an individual, and they will be able to do this for a nation as well. They will be able to give the advice, the exact advice of the hashgacha that takes to literally turn over a complete economy. They will be able to give the advice how to completely vanquish an enemy. You see, they'll be able to understand the hashgacha, to manipulate, to control it in the sense they'll be able to illustrate how to cure a disease, how to cure an economy, a bad economy, how to change a complete condition, how to alter many, many different situations of a person's life by knowing exactly all the laws of the hashgacha and all the variations on those laws. And no one has ever had this koyach. The Nevi'im never had that koyach. And that koyach is one of the ways that the world will know that this is the Mashiach. And what's very important to understand is, where does the Mashiach get this koyach? Where? He gets it from his or. But what is his or? His or is what? Is the or HaTorah. So what will happen is the most remarkable thing, that all the people who see this, who become, first of all, who are recipients of this thing, and who see this, the people, the Ummah Sa'olim, whatever the situation is, will realize that not only they will see the koyach of the Mashiach and realize that he is the Mashiach, but they'll understand that the whole koyach of the Mashiach comes from the Torah itself, because they'll understand what's going on. And when they see that, they will understand the tremendous credibility of the Torah. You see, and that's what it means that the Mashiach will be Megali Yechudah ba'olam. How does the Mashiach Megali Yechudah ba'olam? That ain't no Mavadoi. Because the Mashiach, by clearly demonstrating, in effect, these koychas will show that what? That everything is in the hands of the Bnei Shalom. Everything is in his yad. That the hashgacha, that the Bnei Shalom controls every aspect of the Bria, every aspect of human life. You see, What's kfira? Kfira is that it's not true. Yeshua is mavadoi. That the Rebbeinu does not control everything. That I have the ability to do things. You see, that's what it is. But the Mashiach, by being able to demonstrate this ability, you see, will clearly show all mankind that this ability comes from the Torah. And by showing that this ability comes from the Torah, it clearly demonstrates that Hashem Mulakim Ein Oid Murvadai. Because the Torah is the ultimate explanation for the entire Hashgacha Pratis itself. So therefore all mankind would realize that what? Hashem Echad Ushmo Echad. That it is the Rebbeinu Shalom who's behind the entire Bria. That's why the Mashiach ben Yosef must be Matzliach. You see, like it says by Yosef, V'chol Asher Hu Oiseh, Hashem Matzliach Es Yodai. That's what he said. Why is there such a Hatzlacha to Yosef? B'tikunoi. Why? Because the union of Yosef is what? Is Mo'oiz. Ephraim Mo'oiz Roshi. Ephraim is the defense of my head. Ephraim, the Mashiach ben Yosef, is the one who possesses my Chochmah. He is the exemplifier of my Chochmah. And therefore, he's always Matzliach. He must. Because the Rebbeinu says, obviously, if the Rebbeinu is the Maskiach in the world, then the Mashiach has to always be right. If he's a representative of Hashgacha. So therefore, the Hatzlacha of the Mashiach ben Yosef is itself the greatest simon of Gili Yechudai. You see how they're connected? That's essentially that's his koyach in its basic theoretical ways. People will see the emes, the Gili Yechudai. Right? They'll see the emes. People, it's not shot that people will believe in the Rebbeinu Shalom and therefore believe in the Torah. People will believe in the Torah, and the main of them believe in the Torah. I mean, in the Rebbeinu Shalom. It's the verse. They'll believe in the Torah because they'll see the Torah in action. One of the most difficult things today is what? Is that we learn the Torah, but it's not relevant. Why? Because even though we learn Torah and we see it, but somehow it just doesn't really work in such a vast scale. Somehow life seems to go on without the Torah. The Hashgacha seems to ignore the Torah. Everything that's going on is without the Torah. Suddenly people will see that it's the Torah in the Chochmah Torah itself, which is basically the explanation of all reality. So people therefore understand through the Torah that Hashem Elokim Ein Lo Mevadoi. And that's what the Gemara says. He says, Halavai. Halavai, they speak Israel should eat. I said, Oisi Taizoivu. Right? The Rebbeinu says, let Israel abandon me, but let them stay with the Torah. Why? Because from the Or in the Torah, Mazdal Mutav, they'll come back. Oisi Taizoivu v'Torah and the Torah they'll keep. Because from the Or of Torah, Mazdal Mutav. That's what the Rebbeinu says, that even if Israel abandons me, even if the world abandons me, let them not abandon the Torah. Why not? Because the Torah contains the Or, that if it's seen in its proper perspective, will eventually, it will return all of mankind to the Rebbeinu Shalom. How? Because the Torah is the essential explanation of the whole Hashgacha Pratis itself. So the Rebbeinu says, I gave the Torah, and the entire world, all Bnei Adam will see, you see, from the Torah, that just like the Torah explains all reality, explains all the Hashgacha, Lemaisa, I am the one who wrote the Torah. Therefore, I am the Mashkiach on the entire world. It is the Torah, the Mashiach ben Yosef will regard the Pnimis HaTorah, the Chochem HaTorah. From that Gilui of the Pnimis HaTorah, the entire world will come to Hasagas Yechudai. V'Hoya Hashem Echad U'Shmo Echad. It's important to note that all this happens before Kibbutz Golis. All this is going on. Once the Mashiach, once the sensitivity has come to Klal Yisrael, and the Mashiach is beginning, has already achieved his personal redemption, and he is now Mashiach. Now that's the process of his Gilui. How does Klal Yisrael know that he's Mashiach? And that's what we're explaining. That what will become very clear to all Jews, all of Klal Yisrael, is this unique koyach of giving an eitzah in any particular situation and always being absolutely 100% right. V'chol asher hu Yosef, the Torah says about Yosef, Hashem matzliach es yodai. There's a hatzlacha with everything that he says and does. Why? Because of his chokhmah. And that will take place before Kibbutz Goliath. That takes place before, in the sense that reveals to all the Jews first, and then later on to the Goyim, that this man is the Mashiach. That's the simon, that he's the Mashiach. You see. Now, how will the Goyim begin to recognize this? Now we see how Klal Yisrael will begin to recognize this. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. You see this in a sense because how much of us know that every time there's a new rebbe comes to town, some guy comes from Eretz Yisrael, he's a makubal and this and that, and he sets up shop, and so on and so forth. People start flocking to him, because he didn't have a lot of tzoros, and so they have a lot of tzoros, and they have a lot of daigas, and they have all kinds of problems, this and that, and you're always looking for Yeshua, somebody help me. So every time somebody comes from Eretz Yisrael or somewhere, whatever the story is, I don't want to be much loud in Eretz Yisrael, but every time some guy comes, usually every time some guy comes and sits up and opens up shop, maybe this guy's got maybe he's got the chokhmah, he's got the das, and then people come and so on. And sometimes if the person is able to do certain things, suddenly gets a reputation as about Memphis. Suddenly, and other people come. But then many people come and they see he can't do, there are many instances he can't and so on. And then they drop out or whatever the situation is and so on. But that's, in a certain sense, what will happen in a certain way with Mashiach. But he's a person who will be right 100% of the time, all the time. You see. So from that will begin to spread an incredible reputation. You can just, like, hey, a magician moved into town, You see, but the difference is this, is that normally when a Rebbe sits down and opens up a shingle, he simply says, do what I say, I hold that this is. The Mashiach will say, do what I say, but I will explain to you why it is like that. He will have the das to understand clearly what it is, and it will be always right. That is a different, that is a brand name of a whole different make. You see. This entire period, it's difficult to say, but when I'm talking about a period here of the Tkufa Mashiach ben Yosef, in the beginning, when he begins his Giloi, and he has this unique koyach, and he begins to disseminate this koyach to all of Klal Yisrael, and all of Klal Yisrael begins to understand that he's Mashiach, takes place over a number of years. It doesn't happen in 1 or 2 days, it doesn't happen in 3 or 4 weeks. There's an approximate amount of time, and I would estimate that the entire Tkufa Mashiach ben Yosef, from the time of the Giloi, that he's Megal himself, till the time that there's Kibbutz Goliath, it's difficult to say, but I would imagine that this process would take, maybe up to at least a decade, up to 10 years. From the time, what I feel more certain about, from the time of the beginning of the Gilui of Mashiach ben Yosef, up to the time of the Mashiach ben David, it's probably in the area of something like 20 years. That's Kufa.
What was the time span?
From the beginning of the Tkuf of the Mashiach ben Yosef to the end of the Tkuf of the Mashiach ben Yosef, till the appearance of the Mashiach ben David, and we'll get into that, and that's still before Gog and Magog, you see, is probably about 20 years. Something that, about 20 years. We spoke about the meaning of the koyach of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Specifically, what we were speaking about last time was the way that the Mashiach ben Yosef fundamentally will deal with the people, with the problems of his time, the special koyachos that he will have, and his unique ability to look into the teva and to look into the hanhog and the hashgacha, and on that basis be able to discern what the future will be and what the tikkun of every person, of what every situation will be. This is, of course, an outgrowth of his koyach hadas. I would like to deviate slightly, although it's not a significant deviation, and just go into some critical aspects of the hashgacha itself. What I'd like to discuss now is something that I've presented at different points in time in the past, but it's very critical to understand in terms of the whole Indian of the tikkun of the Tvei Mashiach and so on. And I'd like to take this opportunity to get a review, in a sense, a review and a panoramic overview of the whole movement of the Hashgacha Pratis throughout time, and where the entire Yemos Mashiach fits in. And basically, the diagram I've drawn on the board, a little complicated, but fundamentally it shows the basic picture. And I'd like to go into this diagram. I'd like to go into the diagram because it illustrates really the movement of the Hashgacha in the entire Bria, from the time that the Baruch Hashem created the Bria to the end, and give a certain in-depth understanding of some of the fundamental themes which govern, which the hashgacha revolves around. Basically, as we know, when we go back all the way back in time to the time of Adam and Rishon, we know briefly that the Baruch Shem created the entire world. He created a zulasai. He created a being which was in a sense kaviyachol external from him, so that he could be mative to that bria. And that bria, of course, is the neshama. But we also know that in order to be mative to that bria, the Baruch Shem wanted, the Baruch Shem discerned or created, or however you want to look at it, a certain chason, which is called Nam B'Tzufa. And because of the chason of Nam B'Tzufa, which emanates from the basic nature of the neshama itself, the neshama is in a position where it cannot benefit from the hatova which the Baruch Shem wants to give it, and therefore it has to be mesakin that chason of Nam B'Tzufa. In other words, it has to earn its hatova. It has to earn it b'schus, v'lo b'tzedakah, and not with charity. So what the Baruch Shem did was he created the world Olam Hazeh as a makom of ishtadlus, as a matter of ishtadlus, where the neshama can earn, or the Adam, the Minanushi, could earn their chelik in Olam Haba. We've gone over this theme many times. There are many tapes covering this thing in great depth, and of course we will not touch it again. Having established this kavanah of lehetiv, what basically happened was there was a hanhoga which emanated from the Baruch Shem, or hashpah. And we've said this many times, that how does the Baruch Shem do something? The Baruch Shem does something by being mashpia, or the lashon is to be mashpia, or the Ramchal, the lashon he uses to be meir, ha'oras ponov, a ha'ora, a certain light in a sense, not an actual light, but a certain hashpah emanates from him, and this has the koyach to do something. One of the primary hashpahs that came from the Baruch Shem is what's called the Hanogas HaMishpat, and the Hanogas HaMishpat refers to the hashpah which is designed to produce the results of being mesakin the chason of Nam B'Tzufa. In other words, the Hanogas HaMishpat refers to all those activities whose specific were done by the Baruch Shem, whose specific objective is to mesakin the chason of Nam B'Tzufa. That means that the Hanogas HaMishpat created Olam Hazeh, it created Olam Haba in its present surah, it created the whole inyan of the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov, it created the entire inyan of the Torah, of the mitzvahs, it created the whole inyan of the guf, the neshama, the guf itself, and of the Torah and Bechira. All these things that fundamentally are the focus of the foci of this Olam Hazeh were created by the Hanogas HaMishpat. The neshama itself was not created by the Hanogas HaMishpat. The neshama was created prior to the Hanogas HaMishpat, which was the original kavanah of the Baruch Shem, which is really it's really the Hanoga of Chesed, pure Chesed itself, the Hanogas HaTova, which created the neshama to be mative to it. But because of the chason of the Nam B'Tzufa, the Hanogas HaMishpat, which is another hashpah which came out, attempts to deal with seeing to it that the person earns his chelik in Olam Haba through his own efforts. Everything which is necessary to fulfill that particular requirement is caused by the Hanogas HaMishpat. Now, there is a possibility, since there's Bechira, that the ultimate kavanah of the Baruch Shem, which is gemative, will not transpire. Because if a person has Bechira, it's possible for him either to makayim what the Baruch Shem wants, or not to do it. So therefore it's possible for a person who's Bechira to frustrate the Ratzon HaBorei. But fundamentally this is impossible, because the Ratzon HaBorei is synonymous with his being, which is existence itself. So therefore, another Hanhoga comes out from the Baruch Shem, from another side, another Hashpah, and that Hashpah is called the Hanogas HaYichud. And that Hashpah, the function of that Hashpah, is to make sure that the Tikkun of Nam B'Tzufa takes place. Those are the two Hanogas which come out from the Baruch Shem. The Hanogas HaMishpat from one side, the Hanogas HaYichud from the other side. The Hanogas HaYichud certifies or it's an insurance or makes sure that the Tikkun of Nam B'Tzufa takes place, that the Hanogas HaMishpat eventually reaches its tachas itself. Now, basically, the Hanogas HaYichud is mostly concerned with keeping the kiyum of the Bria. Since man at any point in time, through his chatoim, has the capacity to destroy the world, the Hanogas HaYichud is such that it always intervenes in some way to attempt to Mekayim the Bria in some way. That's the function of Hanogas HaYichud. Again, I'm not going to go into that. We've gone into that quite a number of times. But these are the two hashpos, the two hanogas that come out of the Bnei Shalom. Again, the Hanogas HaMishpat, the function of the Hanogas HaMishpat is to create those conditions which are necessary in which to establish the tikkun of the Chason of Na'am Tzufa, so that the ultimate hatova that the Bnei Shalom intends for a person should be fulfilled. The function of the Hanogas HaYichud is to ensure that the Hanogas HaMishpat reaches its ultimate climax or culmination. And in that kind of sense, it tends to work against, not in actuality, but it tends to undo the deleterious or the harmful effects that Bechira can introduce into the world. The Hanogas HaYichud is concerned with Mekayim the Bria, and as such it really functions in this world. The Hanogas HaYichud as such, the way it exists in this world, does not exist later on. Because only in this world is it concerned with the Kiyum of the Bria. Fundamentally, the world is really based on Hanogas HaMishpat. Nobody gets into Olam Haba unless he's deserved it. No one gets into Olam Haba Mitoch HaChesed. You see, he's got to deserve it, he has to earn it. That's the fundamental premise of the Hanogas HaMishpat. And that premise could never be undermined. But the Hanogas HaYichud wants to make sure that the world is not destroyed because of the Chatoim of man, and that eventually a certain chelik of the Minanushi, or certain aspects of the Minanushi in terms of its klal, does achieve the hatova that the Bnei Shalom had in mind, the Chatchila. What is very critical is the following. What I have described in very simple terms is the kavan of the Bnei Shalom basically in his creation of the world, and the two hanhogas or hashpos which emanate from him, in which to see that this kavanah is fulfilled. That's fundamentally the basic idea. Now, once we have this basic design or this basic structure repeats itself many, many times with many different variations. And the variations of this fundamental structure, as it repeats itself throughout history, is really the explanation of all human history itself. What do I mean by this? We have said that basically the kavanah of the Bnei Shalom is to see to it that man achieves Olam Haba through his own efforts. In order to do it, very simply, the Bnei Shalom created man in a state of chason. So he took the neshama and put it into a guf and put that person into Olam Hazeh. And that person exists in a state of chason, in the sense that the person lacks a certain necessary koyach which will allow him to be in a state of complete Yeruchnias. What the Bnei Shalom basically did was that the ultimate hatov itself is hasagas yichudoi. The ability of man to be masig the Bnei Shalom in a certain aspect of his yichud, the midah of yichud of the Bnei Shalom, is itself that ultimate reward of man in Olam Haba. What the Bnei Shalom set up as the pivot of Olam Haba is his midah of yichud. In other words, by allowing a person to be masig this yichud, this particular midah of the Bnei Shalom, this is what gives him his tremendous tainug and his idun, his pleasures, hanoah in Olam Haba. That's what it means. It means that the neshamas will be able to be masig this yichud in Olam Haba. Now the Bnei Shalom has other midas besides this yichud in a sense, but the key midah on which the Bnei Shalom created Olam Haba was with the midas hayichud. His midas hayichud and the hasoga of that midas hayichud is fundamentally the source of the hanoah that people will have in Olam Haba. In order to allow a person to enjoy that midah later on, the Bnei Shalom took the person and put it into Olam Hazeh, and he gave him bechira with a certain avodah of the Yetzer and the Yetzer Tov. Fundamentally, what that avodah is concerned with is itself the avodah hayichud. In other words, the fundamental test and the fundamental pivot of all bechira is whether or not a person wants to be masig yichud or not. To the extent that a person wants to be dovek to the midas hayichud in Olam Hazeh, to that extent he will be masig the midas hayichud in Olam Haba. It's zeh keneged zeh. Midah Keneged Midah, which is the exact Indian of the Nam of the Hanogas HaMishpat. You see, and that's the Indian of Nam Leksufa. Exactly what a man will earn in Olam Haba is exactly what he must acquire in Olam Hazeh. The ultimate tainug of Olam Haba is the Midas HaYichud itself. So the ultimate avodah in Olam Hazeh is the Midas HaYichud itself in Olam Hazeh. So the Bechira revolves around this aspect of the Midas HaYichud. The Midas HaYichud fundamentally, very simply means the ability of a person to be masig that the Banishim is Einoid Mavadoi in all aspects of that term. Einoid Mavadoi b'mitziasoi in his existence, Einoid Mavadoi b'shlitasoi in his koyach, in his power, Einoid Mavadoi ben hanhagosoi, there's no one like him, also in a hanhaga, in terms of all his activities, it's all from one being, it's all from the Banishim. These various aspects of his yichud are all subsumed under the concept, under the term called Midas HaYichud. And the ability of a man to understand this in its fullest capacity, to the greatest extent that it's possible, leads to greater and greater levels of tainug and of hana. In fact, the Vilna Gaon says very interesting that the Sudas HaLeviathan, which it says in Olam Haba, but the Sudas HaLeviathan, that all Klal Yisrael and the Tzaddikim will eat from a Leviathan. The Leviathan is supposed to be a very great fish, a dog, which is like, not like a whale, but a very great fish, which will be used for the tzaddikim to be Messianic in Olam Haba. And the Vilna Gaon says very clearly that Leviathan is nothing more, basically, than the Pnimis HaTorah. That Leviathan is the das that people will have, the asogas that people will have in Olam Haba. That's what it is. And he says clearly that there is no simcha, there is no tainug in any way near the tainig which people will feel when they're masi yechudah, when they approach this das of the Banishim in terms of Midas HaYichud. Because it's not just a conceptual, intellectual event, it involves a person's entire being. And it's the perception of absolute yichud and the perception of absolute tiferes or beauty gives the most powerful tainig that is possible. We of course cannot be masig this while we're in this world, in that extent. But that's the Sudas HaLeviathan. And this is the Zach, the Midas HaYichud, the Hasogas HaYichud, which is the Hasog of Einoid Mavadoi, is the tainig of Olam Haba. Again, we've explained this at great length before. In order for a person to earn this Hasogas HaYichud, he has to earn it by being ovid on the Midas HaYichud. In other words, he has to determine whether or not he wants to be dovik to the fact that Einoid Mavadoi, or he wants to be dovik to the fact of Yeshoid Mavadoi. So basically, he must choose between himself versus God. That's really where it's at. He must decide who is the real melech of the world. Is it the Banishim, or is it himself? And depending on that, depends on how he's masig the Yichud HaBoyer. That's the Avodah. That basically is also the essential shittas of the Yetzer and the Yetzer Tov. The Yetzer Tov comes to a person and says, Ato Yetzer L'Ta'as Ki Hashem Elokim Einoid Mavadoi. There is no one like the Banishim in Yichud in any sense. He has the absolute existence and the absolute control. And your tachlis lies in being subservient to that das. And to the degree that you're subservient to that das, to the degree that you break your own gaiva, to the degree that you're magish, a devekis to the Banishim, and you mishabed your own rotzim, you break your own will to be over the Banishim, to that extent you will connect with the Banishim and be doved him and cling to him. To that extent, you'll be zirchet to actually bring in the Midas HaYichud into your neshama through certain eres, and you'll be zirchet to that level of Hasogas Yichud later on. The sheet of the Yetzer Hara is not like that. The sheet of the Yetzer Hara is Yeshod Mavadoi. You represent the counterpart to the Banishim. The Banishim is not the ultimate, absolute ruler of the world. You share that rulership with him, albeit on a smaller scale, but he is not an absolute monarch in that kind of sense. That's the meaning of Yeshod Mavadoi. Therefore, listen to your own will. Do as you see fit unto what you think is best for you. You are an independent and a free spirit unto yourself. That's the sheet of Yetzirah. Therefore, be dovik to what brings you satisfaction, what brings you physical satisfaction, what brings you emotional satisfaction, kaivas, gaiva, kovod, kina, sinner, all these things that bring you emotional stability or satisfaction, or whatever have you, and physical tranquility. This is where your avoid is. And when a person is dovik to this thing, what happens is he becomes David to the sheet of the Satan. He therefore becomes David to a certain Zoyama which enters into him, and he loses out in his ability then to be Mati Yehuda in Olam Haba. Why? Because by being David to the Shita of Yesh Oid Mevadoi, he's David not to the Midas HaYichud, but to the Midas HaPirud, the Midah which says everything is separate, exactly the opposite. And when he's David to that Midah, he lacks the ability to connect to the Midah of Yichud in Olam Haba, which is the fundamental Tainuk. Very simply put, this is the avoid of the person. The fundamental of the avoid of the person rests on the Midas HaYichud. Or either Einoid Mavado or Yeshoid Mavado. That's basically what it is. And to that degree, that's what he has in Olam Haba. What the Buddhism did therefore when he created Olam Haba, he created a Makom which allows a certain break in the Midas HaYichud. The initial condition of Olam Haba, which is the time of Adam Rishon before the Chet, was a certain kind of condition. But it was a condition relative to a certain level of the Midas HaYichud. Remember, the Midas HaYichud constitutes the fundamental pivot of the Bechira. Why? Because it constitutes the fundamental pivot of the reward, of the Gemur. But what was the level of the Midas HaYichud in the first circumstance of Olam Hazeh? That level was the Midas HaYichud which Adam HaRishon found before the Chet. It was a very powerful level of Midas HaYichud. However, what the Bonishim did was that when he created Olam Hazeh, he created Olam Hazeh with a certain level of Midas HaYichud perceived in the world, which was very far from the Midas HaYichud which is able to be perceived in Olam Haba. You see, therefore everything which exists in Olam Hazeh, the person, his hasogas, his entire situation, had a certain hefta on that Midas HaYichud. In other words, if the Midas HaYichud in Olam Haba was a certain intensity, Olam Hazeh had a much smaller intensity. So there would be a tremendous gap between the Midas HaYichud as it manifests itself in Olam Hazeh and the Midas HaYichud as it manifests itself in Olam Haba. You see, that gap is called the Chasoron of the Bria. That is the state of Chasoron in which Adam HaRishon found himself. It's important not to confuse the Midas HaYichud and the Hanogas HaYichud. The Midas HaYichud is nothing more than the Bonishom's manifestation, his Midah of his Yichud. The Hanogas HaYichud is something else. That's a hashpor which comes out in order to preserve the kiyum of the Bria. But that's something else. That also comes from his Midas HaYichud, but that's something else. We're talking about the Midah of Yichud of the Bor himself. It's the fact that the Bonishim is Einoid Mervado. That's his Midas HaYichud. Now, in Olam Haba, the Midas HaYichud becomes tremendously open and visible, you see. But in Olam Hazeh, since the Bonishim does not want that to become visible, the Midas HaYichud, as it exists in Olam Haba, in other words, the Bonishim's revelation, his Gilu in Olam Hazeh, is concealed to a large extent. So therefore, Adam HaRishon before the Chet was able to be Masti Yehuda to a certain extent, but nowhere near to what it would be in Olam Haba, you see. Now the Bonishim did this on purpose. The Bonishim created Adam HaRishon in a certain state, and in that state, Adam was created with a certain ability to be Masti Yehuda, albeit a very much smaller degree than Olam Haba. But he had a certain ability to be Mati Yehudai. It was the job of Adam HaRishon to go from a state of the Midas HaYichud, which he found himself in his condition and in his time, and bring himself and his entire world up to the Madrega of the Midas HaYichud, which is found in Olam Haba. And basically, that process is called Zichuch. That's what Zichuch is. When Adam HaRishon would do the mitzvah, and by doing the mitzvah, would be over in the Midas HaYichud, he would then bring up the entire Bria to the Midas HaYichud of Olam Haba, which is what? The Zichuch of the entire Olam Hazeh, so that Yeruchnis goes right through. I'm saying the same thing I said before in slightly different words, but I'm being a little more exact. You see, that's what Zichuch is. Zichuch is the avodah of Adam, in which to take the world of Olam Hazeh from a low level of Hasagas Yichudai, a low level of Midas HaYichud, you see, HaKos of Midas HaYichud, to the level of Midas HaYichud of Olam Haba. So, the level of Midas HaYichud in which Adam HaRishon found himself, we shall call Midas HaYichud 1. That is the first stage. That represents the specific condition of the Midas HaYichud as it was in the time of Adam HaRishon before the Chet.
Is there an equal...
Therefore, the Midas HaYichud, as it manifested by Adam HaRishon Kodim HaChet, was the highest Midas HaYichud that is possible in Olam Hazeh, before it goes up to the Madrega of Olam Haba. You see, It's the highest madrega of Midas HaYichud. That's why the state of Adam Rishon before the Chet was the highest that was ever possible. Because the Gilui of the Bnei Shalom and the Gilui of his Midah was the highest possible for Olam Hazeh. Anything higher, you start moving into Olam Haba. But the Bnei Shalom doesn't want that. He wants man, he wants Adam to bring the world from the Midas HaYichud, from the state of Midas HaYichud, up to madrega of Olam Haba. He wanted the fundamental tachlis of Adam Rishon was to masakin them, in order to bring the world up from a level of Midas HaYichud 1, which is his level, to the Midas HaYichud of Olam Haba. And that was called Zichoch. Therefore, the Madrega and the Olam of Adam Rishon before the Chet is said to be a Madrega of Chesaron. A Chesaron. It was Adam's position, his function, his tachlis, his objective, to be mishmashlim, the Midas HaYichud that was found in his condition, in his world, and elevated to the level of Midas HaYichud to Olam Haba. Adam Rishon, however, failed. When Adam Rishon failed, he introduced something else. Up to the time of Adam Rishon, the only active midah that existed was the Hanagas HaMishpat. Because the Hanagas HaMishpat simply created all these ingredients. It created Olam Hazeh. It created Olam Hazeh. It created the Yitzhar and Yitzhar Tov. It created the level of Midas HaYichud that the world had up to that point, which would be the pivot of Bechira. And it created the entire condition, the entire state of Chassan, which is necessary for Adam Rishon, was created by Hanagas HaMishpat. When Adam did the Chet, what happened was, he did something which was not in the purview of the Hanagas HaMishpat. He brought in a new level of Tumah into the Bria. By being Dovik to the Yeshua Nevadoi, he became Dovik to the sheet of the Satan, of the Yitzhar. By being Dovik to the sheet of the Yitzhar, what happened was, a certain Tumah, which has to do with Ra, and Zoyama, which the Bnei Shalom had created from the Hanagas HaMishpat, but which was never actually in the Bria. It was only a force which the Satan could use to manipulate Adam to do a Chet. But when Adam actually did the Chet, that force itself, that Koyach of Tumah, that Zoyama, went into the Bria itself. Once it went to the Bria, what happened? What was affected? What happened was, the Midas HaYichud, which existed in the time of Adam, you see, suddenly changed, and it became much lower, just by the Chet itself. In other words, the Bnei Shalom did nothing to the Bria. The Bria was created with Adam Rishon at a certain level of Yichud. The Chet of Adam Rishon suddenly took that level of Yichud and lowered it even more. Because when the Zoyama entered in, when the Yitzhak actually entered into the Bria as such, actually what it really is, the Zoyama entered the Bria, because the Zoyama independently went into the Satan as well. But the point is, when the Zoyama went into the Bria, the Midas HaYichud, the way it's manifest in the Bria, suddenly went down. So therefore, what happened was, Adam Rishon after the Chet found himself in a very strange situation. His world now was at a different level of Midas HaYichud. We call that Midas HaYichud 2. Midas HaYichud 2 was a level of Midas HaYichud, or level of Gilo Yichudoi, which was 2 steps away from Olam Haba. You see, because of the fact that there was a new introduction of Tumah as well. So it was 2 steps. As soon as that happened, well, actually before that happened, the Hanagas HaYichud instantly became activated and began to deal with this situation. It allowed, it's the Hanagas HaYichud which allows the Tumah to go into the Bria and lower the Midas HaYichud down to the level of Kilkul. The level of the Midas HaYichud of Adam Rishon before the Chet was in the level of Chassan. But after the Chet, it was in the level of Kilkul. So the whole Midas HaYichud itself, the midah or the ability of a person to be masig the Bnei Shalom or magish the Bnei Shalom, is now in the state of Kilkul. Before it was only a state of Chassan. Now it's in the state of Kilkul, so now we're dealing with a world where the Midas HaYichud manifests itself in the state of Kilkul. The Midas HaYichud, in and of itself, is always the same. The Yichud HaBoyer doesn't change. The Bnei Shalom himself does not change. Ani Hashem Lo Shanisi. He is the same throughout all time. What changes is our ability to be masig this midah. You see, in Olam Haba it's at a certain level, the highest level. In Adam Rishon before the Chet it was at a lower level, and now that Adam was Mekasel the Bria, it's at an even much lower level. But the kilkel that was brought in on the Midas HaYichud, on the ability to be masig Yechudoi, is something which is brought in from Adam Rishon himself. He was Mekasel his own ability to be masig Yechudoi. Hence he is now very, very distant from Olam Haba. But the Midas HaYichud itself, in terms of the Bnei Shalom, of course, is in no way affected. the Midas HaYichud of Adam was affected in the sense that it now has a tumah on it, or klipa, as they say, in the Kabbalistic terminology, a certain klipa, a certain tumah came on it, and therefore made it much more difficult to be Masi B'chudai. So that's just the concept. Now, once Adam Rishon was Mekalkel, the Midas HaYichud, which was accessible to him, so therefore now the Midas HaYichud was now 2 steps further from Olam Haba, from the Midas HaYichud Olam Haba. It was in the state of Kilkul, and it was in the state of Chasson. What happened is, in order to remove that, in order to masaken that, something very critical had to happen. Adam Harishon's ability to be masaken the Midas HaYichud before the Chet is called the Mashiach ben David. That's what it's called. The ability of Adam Harishon, the unique potential that Adam Rishon had to masaken the Midas HaYichud before the Chet and bring it up to the Midas HaYichud of Olam Haba, that's called Mashiach ben David. And that's why Adam Rishon, had he succeeded, he would have been the Mashiach, you see. But, he would have been the Mashiach as such. His task would have been synonymous to Mashiach ben David, except that there was no real Mashiach ben David. In Adam Rishon before the Chet, the ability to raise the walls from the Midas HaYichud in his time to Midas HaYichud of Olam Haba, that was called Mashiach. Period. Or in other words, to bring the Bria to the level of Chasson to Shlemus. When he did the Chet, and he lowered the Midas HaYichud, he was Master Yechudai, and he lowered the Midas HaYichud in a state of Kilkul. Now it would require 2 steps. So what happened is, the ability to masaken the Midas HaYichud, which is the essence of Mashiach. The Mashiach, the definition of Mashiach refers to that process which is masaken the inyan of the Midas HaYichud. That's it. That's the whole concept of Mashiach. The Mashiach is the process whereby the Midas HaYichud is established in it, has a tikkun. Now, if Adam had done this before the Chet, the tikkun would have been 1 step. Now that the Chet brought in a kilkul to the Midas HaYichud, the tikkun now needs 2 steps. So hence the process of Mashiach, which refers to the tikkun of the Midas HaYichud, split in 2. The part of the process now which is required to masaken the kilkul, to remove the zoyama, to remove the tumah from the Midas HaYichud, that is called the Mashiach ben Yosef. And the part of the tikkun of the Midas HaYichud, in which to raise the level of the Bria from the level of Chasson to Shlemus, which is to raise the Bria from the level of Adam Rishon before the Chet to the level of Olam Haba, that's called Mashiach ben David. But that's really what it is. The Mashiach is nothing more than the tikkun of the Midas HaYichud. And as that Midas HaYichud entered 2 different stages of Kilkul and Chasson, the Mashiachs entered 2 different stages as a process. Since the time of Adam Rishon, the entire Bria has been preoccupied with 2 fundamental processes. It has been preoccupied with the fundamental process of being masaken the Midas HaYichud from its kilkul, to remove the zoyma and to metar the Midas HaYichud, and it's also been involved in being masaken the Midas HaYichud in terms of its chesron. You see, therefore these 2 processes.
How can it really be involved in both?
Since the time of Adam Rishon, the Chet of Adam Rishon, the whole Bria has been concerned with 2 processes. These 2 processes are the 2 tikkunim. The tikkunim of the Midas HaYichud. As we have said, one tikkun process is called the Mashiach ben Yosef tikkun, and the other tikkun is called the Mashiach ben David tikkun. The Mashiach ben David tikkun is also referred to the tikkun hayamin. It's referred to the tikkun of the right side. And it corresponds to Midas HaChesed. That is a piece of information. The tikkun of Yosef corresponds to the left side, the tikkun HaSmoil, and it corresponds to the Midas HaDin. These things have important ramifications. But these are the 2 tikkunim. The right side, the Mashiach ben David, or the tikkun of the Mashiach ben David, which is the tikkun of the Chasson, is always on the right side, and it's symbolized by a lion, an Ari. The tikkun of Yosef, which is on the left side, in that figuratively, is always symbolized by a shor, by an ox, and so on. And those are the 2 tikkunim. The lion and the ox, the lion on the right side, the shor on the left side, symbolize the Mashiachim. And the 2 Mashiachim are nothing more than the 2 tikkunim. 2 tikkunim. And what are the 2 tikkunim? They're nothing more than the 2 tikkunim of the Midas HaYichud. What's tikkunim? The first tikkun to take the Midas HaYichud from Kilkul to Chasson, to remove the consequences of the Chet of Adam Rishon, and the second one to take the Midas HaYichud from the state of what? Of Chasson to the state of Shlemus, and masaken that inyan itself. That's it. That's why the avoid of the Bria, since the time of Adam Rishon after the Chet, has always been involved with these 2 tikkunim. Well, therefore we see the concept of the 2 Mashiachim, that the 2 Mashiachim, it is a much more broader term. the entire avoid of the Bria, the entire avoid of the Bechira, or the entire Bria itself, the whole tikkun of all Olam Hazeh rests on these two processes. You see, that's why the Trei Mashiachim are simply much more than just two individuals. The two individuals who will appear at the end, or which will appear when the Moshe Mashiach starts, whenever that may be. You see, we will go into that in a minute. It's irrelevant when the final outcome of these processes are. The two people, the Mashiach ben Yosef in persona and the Mashiach ben David in persona, an actual person, are simply two people who come at the climax of these tikkunim. You see, that's all. They represent the finishing point of these two tikkunim. But basically, the Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David really constitute processes, and they constitute the two fundamental processes of all time. Everything which happens in the world, and I cannot overemphasize this, everything which has ever happened in the world from the time of the beginning of the creation of the Bria, when the British first created the first barrier in the world, until the end of the Olam until the end itself of the end of Yom Adin, when everything is in Olam Haba, is involved with the process of the Trei Mashiachim. There is no other function, there is no other process that takes place in all of creation except for these two processes, because that's it. Both processes are fundamental subsidiaries of the concept of tikkun, and there are only two tikkunim. That's why the Ramchal says that the Trei Mashiachim constitutes the fundamental processes of tikkun of the entire Bria. To look at therefore the Trei Mashiachim as people is a very short-sighted, narrow viewpoint. What it really is, you must look at it in terms of processes, and this is very critical. If Adam Rishon had not done the chait, if he had done the mitzvah, what would have happened? He would have brought his midas hayichud of his world and brought it up to the level of Olam Haba. He would have therefore brought the kates. He would have ended the world. The kates, what is the kates? The kates refers to that period of time which constitutes the fulfillment of the tikkun. When the world achieves its tikkun, you see, that's the case. That's the end. If Adam had done the mitzvah, he would have brought the case. He would have raised his world to a level of Olam Haba. The case would have happened at that point because the tikkun would have been fulfilled. Adam failed to do it. He failed to bring the case. Adam would have been able to bring the case through the Maisa of Bechira. That means that the only way the case could have come in the time of Adam Rishon is how? Through Bechira. Through the Hanagas HaMishpat. You see, and that's fundamentally it. The Banishim created man so that man should bring the case. Man should bring the tikkun itself. Adam failed, so he failed to bring the case from the Hanagas HaMishpat itself. The next generation. In the next generation of Cain v'Hovel and so on and so forth, what happened was the Midas HaYichud went down. It went to a bigger level of Tumah. The Midas HaYichud had a greater level of Hester. So, we are now looking at the second generation. We're not going to go into the details of each of the generations. We're talking about the second generation from Adam Rishon. In the second generation of Adam Rishon, they're already dealing with a new level of Midas HaYichud. It's first of all a level of Midas HaYichud which is in a state of Chassan. It's also a level of Midas HaYichud which is in a state of Kilkul. You see, because of that, the Midas HaYichud which existed in the second generation is very different than the Midas HaYichud which existed in the time of Adam Rishon. It was the function of the people in that time, to take that Midas HaYichud with the type of Bechira that Midas HaYichud represented and attempt to masakin it. But the tikkun there was two tikkunim already. To masakin Alpi Yosef and Alpi David. To masakin from a Zoyamah and to masakin it from its Chassan. If they had achieved what they would have done, they would have brought the case. Again, the case at that time would have been brought because of Hanugas HaMishpat, through the Bechira of those people. They failed to do it, so we went into the third generation. The third generation now had to deal with a Midas HaYichud, which is much worse than that of the second generation. How is it worse? It's worse in the sense that there's a much greater kilkul now on the Midas HaYichud than what exists in the second generation. Here we see a very interesting concept. That the difference between the second generation and the first generation was that the second generation had a Midas HaYichud which had in it kilkul. Adam Rishon only had a Midas HaYichud of Chassan. After the Chet, it was a Midah of kilkul. But in the third generation, they had an additional inyan of kilkul. That means that the drop from the second to the third is not as great as the first to the second. Because from the first to the second, it went from chasson to kilkul. From the second to the third, it went from kilkul to kilkul. In other words, from then on, the Midas HaYichud is simply going deeper and deeper into kilkul. That process where the Midas HaYichud goes deeper and deeper in the kilkel means that the Yetzer Hara is becoming greater and greater. That process is technically referred to as Tigberis Hara. You see, who is responsible for that process? The one who's responsible for that process is the tikkun of the Hanagas HaYichud. The Hanagas HaYichud sees to it that every time the generation fails to be mezachech and to be matar that Midas HaYichud, then the Yetzer Hara has a greater access to that Midas HaYichud and it's lowered. Why should it do that? What does that achieve? That achieves the gula from another side. That achieves the gula from the Hanagas HaYichud. Fundamentally speaking, it is also possible for the ultimate gula to come from the Hanagas HaYichud. The Bonishim saw to it when he created the Bria that man must bring the cakes. Man must be matar mazach the Midas HaYichud. However, what the Bonishim did allow was that the last option, if man completely fails to bring the matar mazach the Midas HaYichud through his own efforts, in a sense to the Hanagas HaMishpat, that the Hanagas HaYichud will be matar the Midas HaYichud. How does it do that? That's the whole pneumius of the Hanagas HaYichud itself. It works through Yisurin, it works through Niyat of Bechira, it works through a number of different aspects, which I'm not going to go into it now. But that is fundamentally the way that Hanagas HaYichud will ultimately bring the case. That's what the pasuk says, Ani Hashem be'ita achishenu, which is the parsha of this week. It means that the case can come one of two ways. The tikkun can come one of two ways. Either it can come be'achishana, which is through the deeds of men, through the Hanagas HaMishpat, or become be'ita. It can come in a way from the Hanagas HaYichud. It comes at a certain time when it comes not through the deeds of men, but because of the Hanagas HaYichud, because of the will of the Bonishon, the Ma'ani Yaseh, and also because of the Schus of us.
So basically,
the tikkun is either brought to the Hanagas HaMishpat, the Achishenu, or to the Hanagas HaYichud be'ita. And the two midas are inversely proportional. The more generations go by, then the Midas HaYichud goes into a greater Hester. As the Midas HaYichud goes into a greater degree of Hester, the Hanagas HaYichud has to take over and slowly bring the tikkun from its own way. So they're both inversely proportional. Now basically, this goes on from generation to generation. Each generation has its own Midas HaYichud to deal with, in that sense. And each generation has the ability to bring the case or the tikkun on the Hanagas HaMishpat. You see, as Klal Yisrael does more and more chatoim, it means that in order to bring the case from that generation, it means Klal Yisrael has to do tshuva. You see, so that each generation has a certain nekuda or certain ability to do tshuva in order to bring the case. If it fails, then the Midas HaYichud goes then on further into a hester, further into a klippa, further into a tumah for the next generation to start, until finally we come to the end. And finally at the end, when we get down to the last generation, if the last generation finally fails to do it, what happens is mankind no longer therefore has the ability to bring the tikkun of the bria. The tikkun therefore is suddenly taken out of the hands of man and it's brought totally into the hands of the Hanagas HaYichud, which already has it by a tremendous way, and Hanagas HaYichud brings the tikkun. And that's what it says, the Bonishim will bring the Gula Asida. In the ultimate case, if man is not Zoicha, he will bring it because of his own namesake and because of the schus of the Shloisha Avos. That's it. Man has failed to bring the tikkun himself. And that's what I say is, and just as a side point, we are reaching the level where we're almost down to the case. And the truth of the matter is, I firmly believe that this Bria will never reach the case. The Geula will come before the case itself. Why? Why do I say that? Because the truth of the matter is this: it is ochen vei oivavoy if mankind has to come to the Geula, but as any nam d'ksuv for all, fundamentally, if we have to come down to the Geula, where we have to mamish come on to the total chesed of the Bonishon, when the Bonishon himself doesn't really want that situation. The Bonishon wants us to bring the tikkun by our own efforts, you see. So in that, because of that, it is a terrible indictment on mankind that the only way they can finally get into Olam Haba is be'ita. That is a terrible indictment on the state of mankind. I do not believe that the Bonishim's faith in mankind is so undermined, is so poor, that mankind lacks the entire ability to make it on its own feet, where it needs a total handout, in that kind of sense, from the Bonishim. I believe fundamentally that what will happen in the Gula Asida, and I believe what will happen, the Vilnigon seems to be more of this, and seems to point to this, that in the end, the case will be brought fundamentally mostly to the Hanagas HaYichud, but there will be a certain amount of Bi'achishena. so that there's a certain inyan where mankind still brings the case on his own efforts. So there's a certain inyan still of covered ha'adam left in this particular situation. When I say that the Bria probably will not reach the case, it'll be before. There's something we have to clarify it. Let's say the Bria should reach the case in the Gula. That doesn't mean that the Gula is coming without any of the efforts of man. That's impossible. Because that would mean a complete removal of the Nogas HaMishpat. No, the Tikkun of the Bria must come through the efforts of man. It must. There's no question about it. The world, the Minanushi, must have the schus to ultimately bring the case. There's no question about it. Or else there's no Tikkun of Nam Sufa. What I mean is the following, and this is what's critical. What I mean is the following, that even though mankind has many great schusim, and because of their schusim, they are misaken fundamentally aspects of Nam Sufa, but mankind as a totality cannot reach the threshold of Nam Sufa to bring in Olam Haba. That's a different story, you see. No one can ever get into Olam Haba unless he's Misaken Nam Sufa, unless he earns it. However, the ability of mankind as a totality, as a collective entity, to totally remove Olam Haba and bring the entire state up to the level of Olam Haba requires a minimal threshold. So therefore, that's the problem. The problem is that mankind as a whole has never been able to bring the Gula or the case on its own efforts. It has been able to establish Olam Haba. It's been able to establish it so that the people will be in Olam Haba. But it has never been able to establish the minimum amount of Kedusha and Ruchnius which is necessary for suddenly the Zchus itself to turn over Olam Haba into Olam Haba. It means that the Bonisham has to turn it over. And that's a terrible thing. That the Bonisham, Saka says that people will get into Olam Haba on their own merits. But mankind as a collective entity, as a Minushi, has never been able to muster up the Ruchnis and Tzchus that they should be able to push the button and suddenly convert Olam Haba into Olam Haba. That is a bad indictment in that sense. And that thing is what Anogas HaYichud works at. That Anogas HaYichud says that no matter what the situation is, whether mankind can bring it through or not, Anogas HaYichud will someday convert the entire world from a level of Olam Haba to a level of Olam Haba. As a level of Olam Hazeh to Olam Haba, as a level of the Minanushi in that sense. But there's no question, Anogas HaYichud does not replace Anogas HaMishpat. It does not take away the necessity, basically, of mankind to create the Olam Haba itself. That it doesn't do. But what it does is the ability to save the Bria, in spite of all the Chatonim that are on top of it, and yet being able to convert this entire Bria into a state of Olam Haba. That may be required. But I maintain that even in the end, man will be able to do it himself. He will not have to descend down to the level of the pure case. And in the end, there will be a certain vestige of his own deed, which not only will be able to create an Olam Haba, but which actually be powerful enough to actually convert Olam Haba into Olam Haba on its own terms. Fundamentally, the Anogas HaYichud cannot work unless there's a certain amount of schusim. What's fair to be clearly understood is that what brings fundamentally Olam Haba, what brings Olam Haba is the schusim of mankind itself in terms of its mitzvahs. However, the total amount of schusim that mankind has never been enough to suddenly stop the entire matzav of shtadlus and start Olam Haba. It has never been enough to stop the situation and has reached the minimal threshold which suddenly can convert the entire situation into a Ma'aseh Olam Haba. But there has been a great many schusim, but it hasn't reached the full level yet in that kind of sense. So because of that, the Anogas HaYichud then comes in and it's matahir the Chatoim and the Zoyma, so that the Bria can then be converted, so that the people can then go into Olam Haba and get what their schusim should have gotten them in the first place. However, if it wasn't the fact that mankind has certain schusim, in any sense, the Anogas HaYichud could not work. The Anogas HaYichud cannot work on its own without any schusim. You see, because the Anogas HaYichud cannot bring the tikkun of the Bria. It's the Anogas HaMishpat that brings it. Olam Haba is based on Anogas HaMishpat, and therefore, in order to get into Olam Haba, you must have certain mitzvahs. However, if you fail to bring out the minimum amount of mitzvahs which are needed to create the Olam Haba, to turn the Bria over into a matzah from Olam Hazeh to Olam Haba, then the Anogas HaYichud comes into an assist mode and assists that possibility of happening. But basically, in order to get into Olam Haba, you have to have schusim. The Anogas HaYichud does not give anyone Olam Haba if he has no schusim. That's impossible. What the Anogas HaYichud does is simply makayim the Bria. It makes sure that the Bria continues on, and that the Bechira process continues on, and that eventually the Bria can move over into the mode of Olam Haba. But actually getting into Olam Haba depends on the schusim of people.